Hello, dear friends. Today we are going to look at the memoirs of Erwin Bartmann, who was a soldier in the Waffen-SS division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Remember to rate this video and give us your opinion in the comments. And we begin. At the beginning of the path. I joined the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler on May 1, 1941. I was from Berlin and never had any doubt whether I would volunteer for this unit one day, sooner or later. I saw them many times during parades in the cities, on guard at the Reichschancellery, etc. What was striking was their nice uniforms, their comradely treatment of each other, and in addition, all of them were very tall guys, being at least 1 meter 82 centimeters. The Eastern Front, the southern direction. As the offensive to the east continued, we were moving toward Kherson, where the battles were fought from August 19th to 22nd, 1941. Our 1st Battalion stormed the village of Snigirovka. The Russians ran away, dropping a huge number of weapons and ammunition. Next, our aim was toward the Caucasus, and we took Berdyansk, Mariupol, and Taganrog, one after another. The last one fell on October 17th. As we moved from Mariupol to Taganrog, we made a halt on the roadside. The patrol was sent out for reconnaissance and returned shortly afterward, noticing Russian units moving westward passing us. Probably the Russians did not have any idea that we had already broken through the defense at their forward positions, or they were trying to outflank us in order to make an attack from the rear, although the latter was probably unlikely. We set up our machine gun points on the railroad embankment and got our mortars ready to fire right on the road. The battle that followed did not last long. Praise God, we did not suffer any losses, and the Russians moved away, abandoning a large number of weapons and equipment. The offensive on Taganrog went on. We came across an airfield, jumped off from our trucks, and then attacked and captured it, while the Russian planes kept landing and taking off in the air. By the time we reached Taganrog, we were given the mission of capturing the harbor, the port buildings, and, in addition, the radio station, located on a hill nearby. When we entered into the building that housed the radio station, the Russians had already abandoned it. They had broken the aerial, and the entire floor was flooded with the mercury from the broken radio equipment. Some large vessel attempted to leave the harbor, but was sunk by the barrage of our 88mm anti-aircraft guns. I still remember this vessel half sunken in shallow water in 1942. It was a short time before we were taken on leave to France. We kept our offensive to the east, but before long we were stopped and forced to entrench. We stayed in these positions for 3 weeks. We were stretched out over a wide sector of the front because there was a large flat area to defend. I stayed with my telephone between the command post and position of the 3rd Platoon. It was raining incessantly, and the artillery bombardment continued day after day. We waited constantly for the Russian offensive, though it seemed it would never happen. Once a Russian shell burst near my trench, blowing my telephone and my entire stock of hand grenades to pieces. Overwhelmed by the explosion, I couldn't hear anything and thought I was dead, but I was just shell-shocked. There was no telephone, but I was still alive, which meant the most. Our losses were gradually increasing, and everyone who could fight stayed in the line. We had less and less ammo, and literally every shot counted. We were in our trenches with bayonets ready, expecting an enemy attack, and the Russians showed up, but with their hands up, instead of attacking, they surrendered, shouting for us not to fire. They were finished. We witnessed how the commissars who followed them started to run away, and we started to shoot at them, but they were nimbler. By November 17, 1941, we were ready to initiate an offensive on Rostov. On November 20th, early in the morning, we pushed forward. We were supposed to leave at 5 a.m., but the mist was so thick that the offensive was postponed until 11 a.m. The scouts moved first, and after 20 minutes they were followed by the infantrymen, supported by tanks. Later, everyone said that there was never such an offensive before. Normally, when the tanks stopped, the infantry began to entrench, but on this occasion, when the tanks stopped, hitting the anti-tank ditches, we went on the offensive. The ammunition trucks followed us as the engineered units made their best effort to get them over the anti-tank ditches. It was the very next day that we entered Rostov. Nevertheless, we had to abandon Rostov on December 2nd. The enemy was too strong. We were running out of ammunition and food, as we were too fast on the offensive and had to cut ourselves off from the supply lines. There was no communication with the Army headquarters and the intendant units. We were simply left on our own. The weather was very cold. We had no winter clothing, and the clothes we were wearing were obviously out of season. Our retreat was a disaster. We had to get away as soon as possible. The fuel in the tanks of our diesel trucks was freezing, so we had to feed the engines directly. One guy could sit in the cab with a full can of fuel, while the other would pour fuel directly into the engine from his mug. That's all we had to do all the way until we reached our people. Our comrades from the Wehrmacht were taking up defense positions. They did not join us when we entered Rostov. Here in the frozen trenches, we found ourselves spending Christmas and New Year's Eve. We made our dugouts as comfortable as possible, making lamps out of empty tin cans filled with fuel oil and fitted with a wick. In January 1942, we moved to some village and constructed ourselves shelters with machine gun nests in the village houses. For our standards, the conditions were luxurious. In front of our positions, by the river, there were the positions of a rifle company scattered over a wide sector of the defense. We had suffered heavy losses by this time, and there were no replenishments. I remember each of us had to remain 4 hours at the post, then followed by a 4-hour rest. The guys from the rifle company had a more difficult time, because they constantly had to beat back enemy attacks. Often, we had to support our comrades from the rifle company with machine gun fire. As spring came, the results of our work became evident. The snow melted, and the frozen corpses showed up from underneath and quickly began to decay. The stench was unbearable, but soon we were withdrawn from the front and replaced by police units. We were about halfway to Taganrog when it was reported that the Russians had smashed our defensive positions, and we had to go back and knock the Russians out of our defensive lines they had taken. Afterwards, the Russian loudspeakers wished us a good time in France as a farewell. In this way, we learned for the first time that we would be completely withdrawn from the front and sent to France for rest and reforming. Near Kharkov, 1942. We took up defensive positions. The snow was deep and the frost was severe. I got the order to take a reel and run a telephone wire to the neighboring unit's location. The mission was very simple, but along the way I came across the Russians. Actually, it was a Russian women's battalion. It was scary, I have to say. They were jumping out of their trenches, screaming like witches, and I was afraid I was going to be finished. So I rushed out of all of them and finally reached our men. How fortunate I was then. After a couple of days, they attacked our positions. We were forced to retreat and abandon our wounded. After fighting back our trenches, we find that all our comrades had been killed. One of them was my friend, who, as I had been, had served as a telephone operator. We used to carry the necessary tools in our knapsacks, screwdrivers, pliers, and so on. So they put the pliers right in his throat and suffocated him. I had to pick up the soldiers' dog tags of the soldiers who died before they were buried. Who knows what might have happened to me if I had been caught by the Russians that day? The thought of it to this very day still makes me shudder. Near Kharkov, 1943. I went back to my unit when it was getting ready to battle on the Kharkov direction. Starting the offensive, we took over a section of the Russian defense in a ferocious battle. Then the Russians recaptured it, but we regained the position. The end of fighting for this sector of the front seemed to never come. We took it 3 times, expecting that this time would be the last, but the Russians captured our forward guard post once again in a night attack, and our positions fell again into enemy hands. Our squad had to use a ruse to elude the Russians. We saw the Russians closing in on the house we were in, so we decided to outsmart them and not engage in battle. We had an interpreter with us, and he yelled orders in Russian. And then we opened a window, and one by one we jumped out of it and fled. I guess the Russians were pretty surprised to see us leaping out of the window one by one and running past them. As luck would have it, it was only a small isolated group of Russians. Our losses were minimal after all this. Following these events, we began to organize for the offensive on Kharkov. It looked like the offensive launched successfully, but everything was not going so well, and we soon had to pull back with heavy losses. Our high command was not interested in a repeat of Stalingrad. The attack on Kharkov began again on February 18, 1943, and ended on March 18th. The Leibstandarte and Das Reich divisions attacked the city on March 6th, and 2 days later, we broke into the city. The resistance of the Russians became fiercer, and we had to engage in heavy street fighting. Once we entered the suburbs, I was sent to the rear to inform them of the need to send us ammunition. On the way to the rear, I came across a branching of roads. I had to make a decision as to which road to take. After some thinking, I took the right branch, and after a couple of minutes, I noticed a group of soldiers who didn't look German. Those guys stopped too. They waved their hands calling me over, and then I made sure that they were Russians. I moved back, trying to get out of the place as soon as possible, reached a junction, changed paths, and finally reached the intendant's office. Here I reported to the Feldwebel that I saw some Russians. It caused a considerable disturbance. The Russians were just a few kilometers away from the location of our intended units. When I arrived back in my unit in the evening on an ammunition truck, my unit was engaged in hard street fighting for every house. I remember one block we had to clear of Russians. We were running up the staircase of some house, and the Oberscharführer was in advance of me. I saw him slip through a door and disappear. When we ran closer, the door was closed, but he was gone without a trace. We cleared the block from the Russians, but we never saw our Oberscharführer again. It is most likely that he was captured by the Russians. After taking Kharkov, we moved to Olkhany, but we returned to the city after a few days and settled in Soldatenheim, a temporary soldiers' rest house, where we rested, cleaned ourselves of dirt, and cleansed ourselves of lice. After a nice meal, we were given the opportunity to go to the cinema or to the opera. My choice was the opera, and I went to listen to Boris Godunov. However, the offensive went on, and we began to move in the direction of Belgorod. One incident I remember well, like it was yesterday. We were out on a reconnaissance patrol, and things were going normally until we climbed some hill and saw a Russian artillery gun on the top. However, the crew was out of position, and we rushed off before they could fire on us. I was sitting in the sidecar of a motorcycle, which stalled just at the most inappropriate moment, so we ran to one of our vehicles, hopped in, and reached our positions with everyone else. I felt annoyed as my photo camera remained in the sidecar of the motorcycle, so the next day, when darkness fell, the driver of the motorcycle, myself, and another comrade using the other motorcycle headed to the place where we had left our vehicle. After stopping the motorcycle at the edge of the hill, we continued on foot. Then we crawled through some roadside ditches and finally found our motorcycle. After crawling up to it, we managed to turn it on at the first attempt. The Russians, of course, opened fire, but we luckily escaped unharmed. The motorcycle and the camera went back to their owners. It was not long before our battalion began to advance. I and another guy were sent on a reconnaissance. We pulled over by a haystack that allowed us a good view of the surrounding area. We settled in comfortably, but kept on guard. Reflecting back on this moment, I can now say that we acted pretty foolishly, as we had no radio or telephone, and we had no means of contacting our unit. When 2 German planes flew over us, we jumped up and waved our hands at the pilots. They spotted us, but somehow decided we were Russians and started diving. 2 times they fired on us. My friend survived unharmed, but I was shot in the right thigh. As I felt warm blood running down my leg, I pushed down my pants to examine the wound. Thankfully, the bullet was not too deep, so I was able to remove it and bandage myself. We returned to our men and gave the commander a report on the situation. I expected to be sent to the hospital, but they found the wound not serious enough, and I stayed in the line. The Battle of Kursk. The time for the greatest tank battle in history had arrived. We were going to attack on the southern edge of the Kursk Bulge, shoulder to shoulder with the Panzergrenadier Division Grossdeutschland. Our division launched the attack, and while crossing a small forest, I was wounded. The shells blew up over the treetops, and there was so much shrapnel and splinters that every second person was wounded. A shrapnel fragment hit my right shoulder, penetrated my lung, passed a few millimeters from my heart and lodged between my ribs. I lost partially my vision and barely distinguished between light and dark colors. I was taken to a dressing station by one of my comrades who had been lightly wounded. Here I was bandaged and waited for a transport to bring me to the hospital. The vehicle arrived, but on our way to the hospital we were forced to move along the road, which the Russians observed as if it were a palm. They gave no relaxation to the sanitation vehicles, and we received murderous fire, but we managed to get to the hospital. I was taken out of the vehicle on a raincoat that was pulled out as a stretcher and laid on straw. I had to wait because there were a lot of guys with much worse wounds. I witnessed many of them dying right there on the ground. At night, they took me to the operating tent and put me on the table. They gave me some kind of weak painkiller, but I tried to stay conscious anyway. I felt that if I blacked out, I would never come to my senses again. The next day, I was driven to the railroad station, where, together with many other guys, I waited all day to be loaded on a train. A rumor came through that the Russians had broken in. What now? I had already witnessed things that happened to SS Waffen soldiers who got caught up in the hands of the Russians. Fortunately, all ended well. A train arrived and we were taken far to the rear, where we were transferred to another, a more comfortable hospital train. Eventually, I found myself in a hospital in Kursk, where I spent another week. Then I was on the road again, going through Czechoslovakia and Austria to an army hospital. When we stepped off the train, all those who were able to go went to the hospital on foot, and I was among the chosen ones. How we must have looked as we wandered through that little town. The doctors could not find any shrapnel inside my body. Being aware that something was in me, I asked if I could be sent to the SS hospital in Vienna. After long words of displeasure, the local commanding officers agreed. At the SS hospital, I got an X-ray, and they found a fragment of shrapnel stuck between my ribs. It remains in my body to this day. 1945. On April 17th, we reached Lichtenberg, located at the country road between Pilgrim and Markendorf. We took up defensive positions on the edge of the forest the same day. I was in command of a heavy machine gun squad. Having 2 machine guns, we entrenched ourselves and positioned our weapons as we were supposed to. The night was calm. We could hear the sound of artillery guns thundering somewhere in the distance, towards Frankfurt on Oder. And we could not tell whether it was our artillery or Russian gunnery. On April 18th, we were ready for battle, and in the afternoon, we attacked the Russians in our sector of the front. The infantry moved forward first, and we followed them at a prescribed distance, the way we had been taught. Unexpectedly, we heard the rumble of rocket mortars. We were hit by enemy fire, but continued the attack. We were alive, but by evening the order to retreat to the former defensive positions came. 2 of our guys died in that attack, and I myself was slightly wounded. A small fragment hit me in the face. The following day went on comparatively peaceful, and we buried our dead in the Lichtenberg cemetery. After midday, the Russian tanks showed up on the road between Frankfurt on Oder and Mulhouse. We saw the German women and young girls and even children tied to the gun barrels, so there was nothing we could do. We had no intention of killing our own women and children. What we could do was to stand silently watching as the enemy tanks moved into new positions. This maneuver was a big price to pay for us the next day. At 2:30 a.m. on April 20th, the Russians attacked us, and in this attack, they suffered heavy losses. A bit later, at 5:30 a.m., they came at us again, this time after an intense artillery bombardment. This time, we could not hold our positions. The barrels of our heavy machine guns got so hot that it became impossible to use them further. We retreated to the reserve positions that had been prepared for us. At 6 p.m., a new Russian attack came, this time with the support of aircraft and tanks. Then the Russians entrenched themselves in front of us. The order came in the evening to send forward a reconnaissance patrol to see what forces were facing us. I and 2 other guys went on this sortie. Things were bad. No one to take command. Our officers left us, and there was only the company commander, a kid of 18-19 years old. He had no combat practice and had just graduated from the officers' school. Still, the worst was ahead of us. On April 21st, my platoon commander informed me that our regimental commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Rosenbusch, killed himself. We regrouped and took up the defense line that stretches from Petersdorf to Briesen. In Briesen, we were told that a rail train would be formed at the station to transport us to a place where we would be found a better use. We waited for a while, but this train never came. There were also several thousand refugees and many soldiers of various branches of the military. At last, we made up our minds not to wait for this train. We went on foot to the highway, and there we took up defensive positions together with other troop units. On April 21st, the Russians attacked us again. They were backed by tanks, assault aviation, and Seydlitz troops. Seydlitz troops are somewhat mythical military units formed of ex-German captives of war who agreed to fight on the side of the Soviet army. After some violent fighting, we retreated back again. Before long, my unit grew in numbers as the Hungarians who fought on our side joined us. I remember going from village to village struggling to find some provisions, as my soldiers only had some food left from their enviable personal supplies. The men were starving, and a soldier is not a warrior on an empty stomach. At one village, we came across the headquarters of some general. We reported our arrival and were given a hot meal, which lifted our morale greatly. We were also provided with bread and some provisions, which lifted our spirits even more, whereupon we started on our way. We met SS Obersturmbannführer Junghans near a place called Starkow, who took charge of us. He asked if I and my soldiers would be willing to follow him, and we agreed to follow him. From then on, I became his personal guard and followed him everywhere. Under his command, there was a diverse unit consisting of many battalions and companies, and he sought to reconstruct the front line held by these units. First, we were in the areas where I used to take a combat training course. Then we drove to Springhagen through Markgrafpieske. Approaching the edge of the village, we saw white sheets on the windows signaling that the locals were ready to surrender. And at that moment, we came under mortar fire and rifle fire from the Russians. We kept moving towards Spreeau. We found out that the Russians had already taken this town and killed some German soldiers. It became clear that among those killed, there were several Waffen-SS soldiers who had been sold to the Russians by an old man who lived in a house that was far away from the others. The following day, April 24th, an attempt to attack a farm, which the Russians had taken the day before, was launched by our commander with several tanks. He intended to seize this farm as it was a crucial position in the defense line he wanted to build in this area. This attack failed, and we lost our commander who was wounded in this battle. We were on our own again and had to go farther west. Not long afterward, we ran into a column of soldiers and refugees who were rushing to the west, anxious to save their lives. So we had to follow them. We made it to Kummersdorf, where we took the fight with the Russians who were chasing us. After this battle, I, along with a small group of my comrades from the Waffen-SS, joined the endless column of soldiers of all branches of the army and refugees going west. We ran into Ziedlitz soldiers again, pushing our way through some woods. As it turned out later, these units were commanded by Soviet commissars. Then the Russian infantrymen attacked us. We moved along a fire break, and the Russians attacked us, running alongside. Ziedlitz soldiers were wearing German uniforms, but armed with Soviet rifles. They kept attacking us over and over again, but some of them seemed to be making an effort to blend in with our column. There was one of these guys right next to us, and we discerned an armband on his sleeve that said Komitee Fries Deutschland. A Wehrmacht officer shouted to us, "Where are the SS? Shoot this man!" For me personally, there was no point. We told the officer that if he wanted to shoot someone, he could do it himself. I really felt a strong distrust for those staff officers. At that moment, we were all thinking only about the same, how to save our own lives. We were going on and on in a huge column of people. I can't remember anymore when we came across the radio tower at Königs Wusterhausen. Probably it was after we escaped from the encirclement. Before we got into the cauldron, we found a large canister of alcohol and emptied it by drinking it, mixing its liquid contents with apple juice. I guess we never would have made it out of the cauldron without that booze. We reached a road somewhere around the cauldron's boundary, between two hills. At the top of each hill there was a Russian gun. Attempting to run between shots, we all, with no exception, slipped between the hills. Only a few of us were slightly wounded. Generally, we were thinking of making our way to Berlin. Since I was from Berlin, I figured it was better to be in the city than to be in the middle of this road mess. Now I think, thank God we never got to Berlin. A lot of my comrades lost their lives in the last battles for the capital. On April 28th, I met my last company commander again. Other officers from my former unit were also with him. We passed through Bielitz, Belzig, and Ziger together, and reached a town called Genthen, where we stayed overnight. The next morning, we searched for a way to cross the Elbe. Near Jericho, we found a half-submerged barge filled with sugar, candies, chocolates, and other delicacies. Each of us stuffed our pockets full of sweets. Then we went back to the shore and hid in the bushes so that the Americans on the opposite shore could not see us. In the evening of the same day, about 6 p.m., an American officer arrived at our shore by a ferry and, upon his own motion, tried to talk us into surrendering. We refused and began to look for a boat to cross to the opposite shore. On April 29th, in the evening, a military unit with the headquarters of some general showed up at our location. They were about to seize the boat from us to rescue their lives, but we refused flatly to hand it over. The general himself appeared to confiscate our boat, but we agreed among ourselves that we would first cross to the other side, and then the two of us would return back to rescue the general. So we crossed and fell right into the position of an American artillery unit. We saw no sentries. Everybody was asleep. We went around their position and went to Königslutter in der Elm. We slept in the woods. The area is mostly wooded in these lands, and we slept there for a day, before setting off again at night. This is how we reached Königslutter, where we found shelter in the SS Field Hospital. I was there until May 13th. Then, because of my foolishness, I was under arrest. I was captured by the Germans, former prisoners of one of the concentration camps. That was the point at which my military service ended. I spent 3 years and 8 months in a British prisoner of war camp, whence I was released on December 24, 1948. Since I was from Berlin, I had no possibility of returning home, so I voluntarily remained in Great Britain, whose citizen I became later, on November 5, 1955. That is all for today. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and support the channel by subscribing. Bye to all of you. See you soon.